38 MacDonalds were killed in Glencoe before dawn on the 13th of February, 1692. For almost 2 weeks before that morning, the soldiers who killed them had lived as guests in their homes. The order to attack was written down. That is the shape of this record: a late oath, a table shared in winter, and a command sent quietly through the chain of government. Glencoe does not need mist to become dark. It has the document. It has the date. It has the old law of hospitality broken so completely that the crime took on a name of its own: murder under trust. Tonight, the archive opens on the Glen, not as a tourist valley, not as a clan feud simplified into a surname, as a place where people were ordered to kill the households that had fed them. The first thing to understand is that Glencoe was not chosen because one bad morning appeared out of nowhere. It was chosen because politics had already made the Glen vulnerable. In 1691, King William offered a pardon to Jacobite clans who had supported the old Stuart line if their chiefs swore loyalty before the first day of 1692. The offer looked like mercy from a distance. Inside the Highlands, it carried a threat: swear in time and be spared. Miss the deadline and be punished by the law. Alasdair MacIain, chief of the MacDonalds of Glencoe, did try to take the oath. The Glencoe Museum account records that word reached him late in December, and he set out for Fort William. But Fort William could not legally take the oath from him. He was sent on to Inveraray through winter roads and hostile country to find the official who could. By the time the oath was sworn, it was late. Not late by a year, not late by a season, late by days. And in the archive, a few days can become a weapon when powerful men are waiting for one. The National Library of Scotland frames the missed deadline plainly. The chief failed to take the oath by the required date, and John Dalrymple, Secretary of State for Scotland, had the opportunity he wanted to punish the clan. That is the first pressure point. The massacre is often flattened into Campbell against MacDonald. That is too small for what happened. Campbells were present. Captain Robert Campbell of Glenlyon commanded the company that lived in the Glen. But the machinery above him mattered. This was not a spontaneous raid across a hill. This was state power moving through old clan tensions, winter roads, late paperwork, and a written order. On the 1st of February, 1692, government soldiers arrived in Glencoe. The Glencoe Museum records around 130 soldiers of Argyll's regiment under Robert Campbell of Glenlyon, arriving with papers saying they were collecting tax arrears and were to be billeted in MacDonald homes. The museum's massacre room page gives the number as 120 soldiers and the same central fact: they were taken into the homes, tables, and company of the MacDonalds. The exact count matters less than the arrangement. They were not camped outside as an obvious enemy. They were inside. The MacDonalds fed them from winter supplies. They gave them lodging through the Glen. They shared drink and shelter. This is the part of the record that must be held slowly. Not because nothing is happening, because the worst thing is happening very quietly. Every ordinary act becomes evidence after you know the ending. A bowl passed across a table, a place made near the fire, a door left unbarred because the man outside had been under your roof the night before. Highland hospitality was not a decoration in this story. It was the line the killers crossed. The Glencoe Museum calls the massacre a grave breach of Highland hospitality. That is why the number alone cannot explain Glencoe. There were larger killings. There were longer wars. But Glencoe stayed in the Scottish conscience because the betrayal entered through the guest room. On the night of 12th February, Glenlyon received his true orders. The surviving order, catalogued through the National Library of Scotland and Scran, was from Major Robert Duncanson to Captain Robert Campbell of Glenlyon. It ordered him to attack the MacDonalds of Glencoe and destroy them. One short phrase carries the whole weight of the archive. Put all to the sword under 70. Hold on that. Not a rumor told by a guide after dark, not a shape in weather. An order. The kind of object that turns atmosphere into record. Some ghost stories begin when the evidence runs out. Glencoe begins because the evidence is still there. The order also instructed that the avenues be secured so no one escaped. That detail matters because it shows intent. The aim was not only to punish, the aim was to close the exits. The geography of Glencoe made that more terrible. A narrow glen, winter mountains, few routes out. A place beautiful enough for visitors centuries later, and on that morning, built like a trap. At about 5 in the morning on the 13th of February, the killing began. The Glencoe Museum says it began in 3 settlements: Invercoe, Inverigan, and Achnacon, though killing took place across the glen as people fled. Men were dragged from beds, houses were burned, people fled into snow and mountains. The archive keeps this colder than spectacle. The archive does not need blood on the floor to be frightening. It needs the sequence: guests, orders, doors, snow. 38 MacDonalds were murdered outright, including MacIain, the chief. Other people died after being driven into winter exposure. Sources phrase those deaths differently. The National Library of Scotland gives an additional exposure figure of 40 after homes were burned. The Glencoe Museum uses a less exact formulation and says countless more perished in the mountains. So the archive should not pretend to settle a single total where sources are not speaking with one voice. It should say what the record can bear. 38 killed outright. More lost to the mountain cold after the houses burned. And a massacre made worse by the fact that the victims had hosted the men who came for them. That is the hinge of Glencoe. If enemies arrive under their own banner, the house knows what it faces. If guests arrive with papers, sit by the fire, take bread, share drink, and wait for the order that tells them when to turn, the house has already been entered before the attack begins. The door is not forced. It is trusted open. Then came the second life of Glencoe, the life after the killing, when the country had to decide what kind of crime it had just heard about. News did not stay inside the glen. The National Trust for Scotland records that when news of the massacre reached the wider public, after first being published in France, a Scottish Parliamentary Commission of Inquiry determined that the killings were murder under trust. That phrase is not decoration. It is the legal and moral hinge of the record. Murder under trust means the death is made worse by the relationship that made the victim feel safe. Hospitality had been accepted, shelter had been given, food had been taken. The men did not merely kill enemies, they killed hosts. That is why the inquiry matters. It stops the story becoming only sorrow. The archive can point to a public record recognizing the thing that made Glencoe different. The records of the Parliaments of Scotland preserve procedure around the inquiry, including parliamentary language about the actors of the slaughter of the Glencoe men under trust and grounds for prosecution. There is a coldness in that phrase. Actors of the slaughter, under trust. The words sound administrative. That makes them worse. They show a parliament trying to place a name on an event whose horror had already happened in cottages, snow and fire. But recognition is not the same as justice. The National Trust notes that many instigators avoided real repercussions, and that much blame fell publicly on Clan Campbell. even though only some of the men involved were Campbells. That belongs in the record, not to soften responsibility, to sharpen it. If this becomes only Campbell against MacDonald, the state disappears from the frame. The written order disappears. The secretary's opportunity disappears. The king's command language disappears into an old family argument that feels easier to file away. Glencoe should not be filed away. It should stay difficult. The strongest dark history does not leave the simple version standing. It makes the simple version feel too small. Glencoe was clan tension. It was also royal policy. It was also bureaucracy. It was also winter logistics. It was also a household crime. And all of those pieces met before dawn in one glen. More than 3 centuries later, Glencoe is still not only a landscape, it is a room. The Glencoe Folk Museum keeps a massacre room in an old dairy converted into a typical MacDonald cottage for the night of the event. The National Trust for Scotland has worked on a recreated turf house to help visitors understand how people in the glen lived. That matters because atrocity can become too large to feel. A valley is too wide. A number can become too clean. But a room brings the crime back to human scale. Where did the guest sit? Where was the fire? Where did the family sleep? Which wall heard the order before the household did? The National Trust's archaeology at the abandoned township of Achnacon has found traces of ordinary 17th century life. Pottery, decorated knife handles, loom weights, shoe buckles, and broken tobacco pipes. Those objects are not dramatic by themselves. That is why they belong in the film. They stop Glencoe becoming only mountains, clans, and names in a history book. They say, these were households. They wove, they smoked, they repaired, they stored, they ate. They opened their doors. Every dark history essay needs one object that refuses to perform. Not a sword, not a skull, a shoe buckle, a pipe, a thing a person touches because life has not yet become history. That is where Old Man Ember marks the difference between horror and theatre. Theatre wants a scream. The archive wants the object left after the scream has already passed. There are traditions and reported hauntings around Glencoe. Older Scotland material in this vault notes anniversary cries, figures running through snow, and the feeling that the glen remembers. Those can remain at the edge of the record, but they do not carry it. The record carries it. The oath carries it. The billeting carries it. The order carries it. The snow carries it only after the paper has spoken. So if the shorter version has one final reframe, it is this. Glencoe is not frightening because people later called it haunted. Glencoe is frightening because before anyone needed a ghost, the living had already done the thing a ghost story is usually invented to explain. They made a home unsafe from inside the home. They made hospitality into access. They made a written order out of a winter deadline. Then they left the glen to carry the rest. The archive marks Glencoe as murder under trust. Not because the mountains cried out, because the order survived, because the table had been shared, because the door was open to guests. This record is sealed.